My rich boss humiliated me in front of her entire social circle, so I made her children cry on cue and watched her empire collapse. In real time, the moment Linda Weston called me a bad mother in front of 50 people wearing diamonds, I stopped being the girl who let things go. I remember the exact second it happened. She was standing near the chandelier in her own foyer, the one I had spent 4 hours helping her pick out from a catalog she kept changing her mind about, and she had that smile on her face, the practiced one, the one that showed her top teeth and nothing else. Her friends were arranged around her like a portrait, champagne flutes catching the light, and she turned to the woman named Clara and said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "You know, Clara here had her baby 2 years ago and still can't change a diaper without calling her nanny." The group erupted. Real laughter, not polite laughter, the kind where someone grabs someone else's arm. I was standing 6 feet away. I had been standing there the whole time. Linda had just introduced me to the group, introduced me as her nanny, which was technically accurate but felt like being introduced as furniture. And I had smiled and said hello and held my clutch in both hands the way you do when you're trying not to disappear into the floor. She kept going. That was the thing about Linda. Once she found a current, she rode it. And once when the nanny didn't pick up, Clara had to call me at 9:30 on a Tuesday night. Because the baby wouldn't stop crying, she tilted her head. I walked her through it over the phone. She didn't even know about the tummy thing. Someone almost dropped their champagne. Then the room shifted, the way rooms always shift around women like Linda, and suddenly she was the subject. What a natural mother. What an instinct she had. 3 kids under 6 and never once lost her composure. Never needed help. Never called anyone at 9:30 on a Tuesday. The women were practically applauding. I stood there holding my smile in place like a physical object I was afraid to drop, and I excused myself, quietly, the way I'd learned to do everything in that house. I found the kids in the back sitting room where I'd set them up before the party with their tablets and a bowl of popcorn. Theo was 6, Mason was 4, Gracie had just turned 3 and still sometimes forgot she wasn't a baby. I crouched down and I started making faces, the ridiculous ones, the ones that required no dignity whatsoever, and 2 of them laughed immediately. Theo and Mason, predictable as ever, but Gracie felt left out. She always did when she wasn't the center. Her face folded. She let out one long, escalating wail that had nothing wrong with it except that it was very, very loud, and within about 8 seconds, all 3 of them were crying harder than I had ever heard them cry. I stood up, smoothed my dress, walked back through the house. The party was still going. Linda was still talking. I stopped at the edge of the group and waited for a pause. "Hey, Linda," I said. My voice was completely calm. "I think your kids are crying. Why don't you go show everyone what those parenting classes taught you?" The room went quiet first. Then it turned. 50 people in evening wear, all of them pivoting toward the sound coming from the back of the house. 3 children absolutely screaming, a noise that filled every corner of that fairy tale house with something very real and very unmanageable. Linda's face went the color of uncooked dough. She rushed to the back room. Half the party followed. I watched her pick up Theo. He was the heaviest, always the wrong choice in a panic, and swing him in that frantic way that makes children scream harder instead of less. He screamed harder. Mason joined in out of solidarity. Gracie, who had almost tired herself out, found a second wind. The entire house was silent, except for the screaming and the sound of Linda saying, "Shh," in a voice that did not work on anyone. I stood in the doorway. I waited until she looked at me, until the look she gave me was the specific kind, the one that said she knew she had lost something and needed me to fix it. Then I walked in. I took Theo first. I said 2 things in his ear. I made one face. He giggled. I handed him to a woman nearby and took Mason. 45 seconds, maybe. All 3 of them were giggling. Gracie had her finger in her mouth and was looking up at me with those wet eyelashes. The room absolutely lost its mind. 2 of Linda's friends pulled out their phones on the spot. I handed out my number 3 times. A woman named Madison, the most elegantly dressed person in the room, the one who had said almost nothing all evening but watched everything, pressed her card into my hand and said quietly, "I'll be in touch." Linda smiled at her friends. She laughed it off. She called me her secret weapon, but I watched her eyes the whole time, and her eyes were not laughing. I need to tell you how I got there, because none of it makes sense without the before. I was 21 years old. I had grown up in Dayton, Ohio, with a mother who worked double shifts at a hospital laundry, and a father who had left when I was 9, and sent birthday cards for exactly 2 years after that before he stopped. I was not poor in the way that gets described in books. We had food, we had heat, but money was always a presence, a weight, the kind of thing you feel even when nobody's talking about it. I had studied early childhood development for a year and a half at Columbus State before the tuition became genuinely impossible. I was good with kids. I had always been good with kids. I was the oldest of 4, and I had been putting other people to sleep since I was 11 years old. I came to Atlanta in January of 2021 with $2,000, a contact number for a woman named Terry who ran a nanny placement service, and a suitcase I had borrowed from my aunt. Terry placed me with the Weston family in March. Linda Weston, 38, married to David Weston, who ran some kind of financial consulting firm and traveled 4 days out of every 7. The house was in Buckhead, a neighborhood I had heard of but never been inside, and it had a pool, a 3-car garage, and a separate entrance for staff that I used for exactly 1 week before Linda told me to use the front door because the back entrance sometimes triggered the alarm. I thought that was generous. I was 21. I thought a lot of things were generous. My rate was $18 an hour. The job was described as 30 hours a week. It was routinely 45. I worked 6 days out of 7 for the first 3 months, and when I mentioned the hours, Linda looked genuinely confused, the way you look when someone describes a color you've never seen. I thought you liked the kids, she said, and I did like the kids, so I let it go. The thing about Linda that took me a long time to name was this. She was never cruel in a way you could point to. Not at first. She was demanding in a way that felt reasonable, one request at a time. She wanted the kids fed by 5:30, which was fair. She wanted the playroom cleaned at the end of each session, which was fair. She wanted me to coordinate with the housekeeper, which was fair. But there was always another request. Always one more thing that was, individually, fair, and collectively, something else. In May, she started leaving her jewelry out when I was around. Gold pieces on the bathroom counter, a bracelet on the kitchen island. I understood what it meant. She was watching, testing. I never touched anything that wasn't mine. And after about 3 weeks, the jewelry stopped being left out, and I thought that was the test passed. In June, she asked me to organize a party. A garden party for her social circle. 50 guests, outdoor catering, florals, a string quartet for the first hour. She offered me $800 on top of my regular rate. I said yes immediately because $800 was $800 and because I was good at organizing and because I still, at 21, believed that competence was a form of protection. I spent 4 weeks on that party. Every detail. The florist on Peachtree was difficult about the peonies, but I called 3 times until she wasn't. The caterer wanted a deposit that Linda was slow to authorize, and I covered it out of my own account for 11 days before Linda reimbursed me without apology. I chose the tablecloths. I chose the lighting. I drove to 3 different stores to find umbrellas in the exact shade of dusty rose that Linda had shown me on her phone at 7:30 in the morning. The week before the party, something changed. Linda had always been demanding. Now she became sharp. She threw a water bottle at me on a Wednesday. Threw it, not dropped it, because I was setting the patio table too slowly. It hit the edge of a chair and clattered to the ground, and she walked away like it hadn't happened. Theo came to find me that afternoon and climbed into my lap and asked why Mommy was being so mean. I told him Mommy was stressed about the party. I held him for a while. That was the job I was actually doing in that house, not the one on paper. The night of the party, I showed up in a dress I had bought at a consignment shop on my lunch break 2 weeks earlier. $312, more than I had ever spent on a single piece of clothing. I had spent 40 minutes on my hair. I wore the small gold earrings my mother had given me when I turned 18. I looked, I thought, like someone who belonged in a house with chandeliers. I had set up the house. I had made it beautiful, and I was standing in it, holding my clutch in both hands, when Linda introduced me as her nanny, and then began to perform. After the party, after the giggling children, after the business cards, after Madison's quiet press of her own card into my palm, I went home, and I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time. My apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building on Juniper Street, 540 square feet. I had a plant on the windowsill that I had kept alive for 9 months, which I was proud of. I sat there and I tried to figure out exactly what I was feeling. It was not triumph, not yet. It was something quieter. The particular kind of calm that settles in when you finally stop hoping someone is going to be different than they are. The next morning, Linda fired me by text. The message came at 8:14. It was 4 sentences. She thanked me for my service. She said the family was going in a different direction. She said she would mail my final check. There was no mention of the party, the children, the 4 weeks of planning, or the 11 days I had covered her catering deposit. I read it twice. I set my phone down. I made coffee. By 11, a flower arrangement arrived at my door. White dahlias and eucalyptus in a glass vase. The card said, "Loved your style. Let's talk." It was signed with Madison's name, and below her name was an address on West Paces Ferry Road that I recognized as one of the most expensive streets in Atlanta. I was going to call her that afternoon. But first, at 12:40, I got a text from a girl named Priya, who ran errands for several families in Linda's social circle. The text said, "Hey, did you take something from Linda's house? Everyone's saying there's a pendant missing from her bedroom." My hands went cold before I finished reading it. I called Linda. She answered on the second ring, which surprised me. Her voice was warm, practiced. She said misunderstandings happen and that she was sure it would all get sorted out and that she just wanted everyone to be able to move forward. She spoke the way people speak when they have already done the thing they're pretending hasn't happened yet. I hung up and called Priya back. "She filed a police report," Priya said. "This morning, before she texted you." I sat down on my kitchen floor. Not dramatically. My legs just decided they were done standing. I had been in Atlanta for 14 months. I had $1,240 in my checking account. I did not have a lawyer. I did not have a family member nearby who could help me navigate what it meant to have a police report filed against you for theft. I had a mother in Dayton who worked double shifts and a suitcase I had borrowed from my aunt. I called Madison. She answered on the first ring. "I heard," she said before I could speak. "How did you—" "Linda is predictable," she said. "When her ego gets bruised, she reaches for whatever's whoever's nearest. I've watched her do it 3 times in the last 5 years. She paused. Come to lunch. Today, if you can. The restaurant was on Buckhead Avenue. I had walked past it but never been inside. Madison was already seated when I arrived at a corner table that faced the room, the way powerful people always sit. She was 61 years old. She had silver hair that she wore at her jaw and a posture that made me sit up straighter just from proximity. She had been in Atlanta real estate for 30 years. She knew everyone in that room, and at least a third of them nodded at her when we walked in. She introduced me to Aiden Park over the main course. He was not physically present. He was on the phone, on speaker, in the middle of what sounded like 2 other conversations. But Madison held the phone between us and he spoke clearly and quickly, and said he charged $1,000 an hour, but that he would help me because he found Linda Weston tiresome and because Madison had asked him to. Those were his exact words. He found her tiresome. We're going to send a cease and desist, he said, to Linda directly and to everyone she's communicated this to. Defamation, malicious false report. We'll demand a written retraction distributed to the same group. Can she actually go to jail? I asked. Unlikely, he said, but she'll fold. She hates embarrassment more than she hates anything else. He was right. She folded in 72 hours. A group email went out to her entire social circle at 9 in the morning on a Thursday. It said the pendant had been in her safe the entire time. It said there had been a miscommunication. It did not mention my name directly, which Aiden had anticipated and accounted for, and a separate personal letter was delivered to my address the following day. Signed, notarized. I framed it. Not immediately, but eventually. I started with the Harrington family 2 weeks after the cease and desist. Madison had made a call. The Harringtons were on the north side of Buckhead, a larger house than Linda's, a different energy entirely. Mrs. Harrington was quiet and organized and thanked me at the end of each day. Their 2 daughters were 7 and 9 and had been told by their parents that I was there to help, which meant they treated me like someone who had chosen to be there, which was a different experience than I had had before. I had been with them 11 days when Mrs. Harrington asked me to come into her study. She had her laptop open. On the screen were screenshots of a social media profile, my name, my photo, the real one from my actual accounts. But the content was not mine. Posts showing drug paraphernalia with captions I would never write. Comments that were racist in the specific way that requires intent. Images I had never taken in context I had never been in. Someone had built a fake version of me online and sent it to Mrs. Harrington. I wanted to show you before I made any decisions, she said. She was watching my face carefully and not unkindly. Because Madison vouched for you. And Madison doesn't make mistakes. I looked at the screen for a long time. My photo. My name. Somebody else's poison. I didn't make these, I said. I didn't think you did, she said. I called Madison from the driveway. She called someone named DT, which I later learned stood for nothing. It was just what people called her. DT had blue hair and forearm tattoos and had once done something for the federal government that she was not technically allowed to describe. She arrived at Madison's house with a laptop and 2 external drives and a thermos of coffee that she did not offer to share. She worked for most of an evening. At 11:47, she looked up and said, the posts were created and uploaded from a residential IP address on Tanglewood Road, Buckhead. Linda's address was on Tanglewood Road. I can narrow it further, DT said, but you probably don't need me to. I sat with that for a moment, the specific coldness of it. She hadn't let it go after the cease and desist. She had rebuilt. She had gone back to work. She had found my new employer's contact information and manufactured a reason to end my new position before it could become stable. She had done all of this quietly, from her house on Tanglewood Road, while her kids watched their tablets in the back sitting room. What do we do? I asked Madison. Madison set down her glass of wine. She had a look I was learning to recognize, the look of someone who has been patient for a very long time and has decided to stop. We finish it, she said, properly. Madison hosted a dinner party 3 weeks later. 14 people. The same social circle, more or less, with some additions I did not recognize and one notable absence. Linda herself was not invited, which everyone present understood to be the point. I was there, not as staff, as a guest. I wore the same dress. Madison stood at the head of the table after the main course had been cleared and before dessert arrived, and she spoke for about 12 minutes. She laid out the timeline. She had documentation for everything. Aiden had compiled it, DT had traced it, and between them, they had built something that felt more like a legal filing than a dinner party anecdote, the fake social media profile, the police report filed before any conversation had occurred, the IP address on Tanglewood Road. And then Madison said something that changed the temperature in the room entirely. She said, there are also some matters involving David Weston's financial accounts that I think several of you should be aware of, given that some of you do business with him. She did not elaborate dramatically. She didn't need to. What she described, quietly and with documentation passed around the table, was a set of offshore accounts that David Weston did not appear to know his wife had access to. Transfers that had been occurring over roughly 18 months. Not enormous by the standards of that room, but enough to matter. Enough to constitute something. There was also, she mentioned at the end, a matter of a relationship Linda had been maintaining with a man who worked at the consulting firm David used for his personal accounts. This was delivered with the same even tone as everything else. The same lack of drama. Just information. Just the truth laid bare on a white tablecloth. The room was very quiet. Linda and David Weston left their house in separate cars the following morning. I didn't see it happen, Priya told me. She had seen the cars from the street and texted me at 7 2012. David filed for divorce by the end of the week. His attorney apparently was also a friend of Madison's, which I had stopped being surprised by at this point. I thought it was over. I thought it was finally and completely done. I came home on a Tuesday evening in November to find my front door slightly open. Not broken, not forced. Slightly open, the way a door looks when the latch doesn't fully catch. I had locked it that morning. I remembered doing it because I had been running late and had double-checked. I stood in the hallway for a moment. The building was quiet. The neighbor across the hall had her television on. I could hear the low murmur of it through her door. I pushed my door open. The lights wouldn't turn on. Not the overhead. Not the lamp by the couch. I tried both before I understood it wasn't a bulb. In the light from the hallway, I could see my case files on the floor. I kept physical copies of everything. Aiden had told me to. They were spread across the carpet in a way that meant someone had gone through them deliberately, not knocked them over accidentally. My laptop was gone. The 2 backup drives I kept in the desk drawer were gone. I walked to the bedroom doorway. I did not go in. I stood there and I looked at the wall above my bed, where someone had written words in red paint that I will not repeat here. I looked at them long enough to understand what they meant about the person who had written them. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. I answered because I was already afraid, and answering felt like something I could control. Silence. Then breathing. Slow. Deliberate. The kind that is performed rather than natural. Then a click. I called Madison. She answered immediately, the way she always did. I told her what I was looking at. Leave the apartment, she said. Right now. Don't touch anything else. Call the police from outside. Madison, I know, she said. I'll call Aiden. I stood on the sidewalk outside my building with my phone in my hand and the cold November air on my face, and I waited for the police to arrive. 2 officers came. They were professional. They took photographs. They took my statement. They told me not to touch anything in the bedroom. I gave them everything. The prior police report Linda had filed, the IP trace from DT, the cease and desist, the notarized letter, all of it. Aiden arrived 20 minutes after the officers. He had his own copies of everything in a leather folder, and he handed them over with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this before. Linda was arrested 4 days later. Not at her house. She had already vacated it, as part of whatever arrangement was being made in the divorce proceedings. She was picked up at a hotel in Midtown. The charges were breaking and entering, destruction of property, criminal intimidation, and a related count tied to the false police report from September, which Aiden had been holding in reserve precisely for a moment like this. I was not there when it happened. Priya sent me a screenshot of the arrest notice. I was sitting in my kitchen drinking coffee, and I looked at it for a long time. I felt something. It was complicated. Not satisfaction exactly, though that was part of it. Something closer to the specific exhaustion that comes after a long time of being afraid. The Harrington family asked me to stay. Mrs. Harrington brought it up the week after the arrest, formally with a new contract and a rate that was $32 an hour with quarterly reviews. Her daughters made me a card with markers and glitter glue that said, "Please don't go," on the front, which I kept. Aiden filed a civil suit against Linda on my behalf. The damages were not spectacular. This was not a story with a 7-figure ending, but there was a settlement. Enough to cover the stolen equipment, the legal costs, and enough left over that I could breathe for a few months without counting every transaction. Aiden took his fee from the settlement. He had earned it. I moved to a new apartment in January. A different building, a different street. I got a lock that required a key from both sides. I got a doorbell camera. I replaced the plant from Juniper Street. It had not survived the disruption, with a larger one, a pothos, that the woman at the garden center said was essentially impossible to kill. I appreciated that. DT sent me a text 2 weeks after the arrest. It said, "Nice work staying calm. Most people lose it before the end." I saved it. Madison invited me to a dinner in February. Not a strategic dinner, not a tableau arranged to expose anyone, just dinner. 8 people around a table, good wine, conversation I was actually part of. She introduced me to the woman on my left as a person she admired, and I had to look at the table for a moment before I could respond. The thing I keep coming back to, the thought I have turned over more times than I can count, is this. Linda never saw herself as a villain, not once. I know that the way you know something about weather or physics. She was a woman who had been told her whole life that she was exceptional, and she had organized her entire identity around that belief. And when someone threatened the performance of it, even accidentally, even just by being competent, she responded with the only tool she had ever needed, the ability to make other people feel like nothing. She had done it to Clara at the party. She had done it to me the moment I stopped being invisible. She had probably been doing it her whole life to people who had less than she did, and no one to call. The difference, the only real difference, was Madison, and Aiden, and DT with her thermos of coffee, and her federal government history, and her 24 hours of work that changed everything. I think about the kids sometimes. Theo, Mason, Gracie. I hope someone is putting them to sleep properly. I hope someone knows about the tummy thing, and the faces, and the specific way Gracie needs to be held when she's sad, with her back rubbed in small circles. They didn't choose any of this. Kids never do. I'm 23 now. I work for the Harrington family 4 days a week, and I have 2 other families on a part-time basis. I'm enrolled at Georgia State, online, evenings, in their early childhood education program. It's slower than I wanted. It's real in a way that matters. I still have the notarized letter. I still have the card with the glitter glue. I still have Madison's number in my phone, and I use it occasionally, for dinner and for advice, and sometimes just because she answers on the first ring and says exactly what she thinks, which is rare rarer than it should be. I do not have the plant from Juniper Street. Some things you just lose. There was a version of that year where I stayed invisible, where I absorbed the humiliation at that party and drove home in my $300 dress and filed it under things that happen, where Linda filed the police report and I had no one to call, where the fake profiles cost me the Harrington job and I went back to Dayton with my borrowed suitcase and my mother looked at me and neither of us said the obvious thing. That version was not inevitable. I know that now, but it was close. It was closer than I like to think about. What changed it was not strategy. It was not revenge. Not exactly. It was the decision. In the moment, Linda turned to her circle and performed at Clara's expense, and then turned to find me standing there, that I was done arranging my face to make powerful people comfortable. I made her children cry. Yes. And I walked back in, and I fixed it, because that's what I do. That's what I have always done. And the room saw the difference between a woman who performs motherhood and a woman who actually shows up. And no letter of recommendation or notarized document or Aiden Park filing was more clarifying than that moment. Linda Weston's empire, if it was ever really an empire, was not built on something solid. It was built on the assumption that the people around her would never have the tools or the allies or the nerve to simply tell the truth. She was wrong about one of them. I made sure she knew it.